She died on a Tuesday morning in March, when the snow was just beginning to melt from the corners of the yard and the first brave crocuses were pushing through the cold earth. The house was quiet. It had always been quiet. But that morning, the silence felt different, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Her daughter found her in the bedroom, hands folded across her chest, her face peaceful in a way it had rarely been in life. There was no drama to her passing, no last-minute confessions or tearful goodbyes. She had slipped away, as she had lived, without making a fuss, without asking for attention, without taking up more space than she thought she deserved. In the days that followed, as her daughter began the slow, painful work of sorting through a lifetime of belongings, she discovered something that would change everything she thought she knew about her mother. It wasn't hidden, exactly. It wasn't locked away in a safe or buried in the back of a closet. It was sitting there, plain as day, in a series of worn notebooks stacked neatly on the desk in the corner of the bedroom. Ordinary spiral-bound notebooks, the kind you could buy at any drugstore for $1 or $2. Inside those notebooks was a record of something so simple, so quietly profound, that it would take years for the daughter to fully understand what she was looking at. Her mother had never earned much money. That was a fact everyone knew. She had worked as a checkout clerk at the local grocery store for 30 years, then as a part-time library assistant after that. Her paychecks were modest, barely enough to cover rent and groceries and the occasional treat. She never owned a home, never drove a new car, never took a vacation that required an airplane. To the outside world, to the neighbors and acquaintances who knew her only in passing, she was just another woman who had struggled, who had gotten by, who had lived a life that left no particular mark on the world. But those notebooks told a different story. And right now, as you listen to this, wherever you are in the world, I want you to pause for just a moment. Think about the people in your life who never seemed to have much, who lived quietly, who never bragged about their success or their wealth. Then leave a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to share with you is going to change the way you think about money, about wealth, and about what it really means to live a rich life. This isn't a story about winning the lottery or striking it rich. This is about something far more powerful, far more accessible, and far more real. Her name was Eleanor, though most people called her Ellie. She was born in 1941 in a small town in Pennsylvania, where the steel mills still ran and the air always smelled faintly of coal smoke and industry. Her father worked in the mills. Her mother took in sewing to make extra money. They lived in a narrow row house with thin walls and a bathroom they shared with the family next door. Ellie grew up understanding, without anyone ever having to say it out loud, that money was something you didn't have. It was something other people had. It was something you thought about constantly, worried over, stretched as far as it would go. She was the oldest of 4 children, which meant she learned early how to make things last, how to wear shoes until the soles wore through, then wear them a little longer with cardboard stuffed inside, how to eat the smallest portion at dinner so her younger siblings could have more, how to sit very still and very quiet when the bills came in the mail and her parents' voices grew tight and low in the kitchen after dark. She learned that wanting something was different from needing something, and that even the things you needed, you often had to do without. But there was something else she learned too, something that would shape the entire course of her life. She learned it from her grandmother, her father's mother, a stern woman with iron-grey hair and hands that were always busy, always working. Her grandmother lived with them for a while, sleeping on a cot in the hallway, contributing what she could from her widow's pension. And every Sunday evening, without fail, Ellie's grandmother would sit at the kitchen table with a pencil and a small leather-bound book, and she would write down every penny she had spent that week. Ellie would watch her, fascinated by the careful way her grandmother formed each number, the way she added the columns twice to make sure they were right, the way she would nod to herself when everything balanced. One evening, when Ellie was 9 years old, she asked her grandmother why she bothered. They barely had any money anyway, so what was the point of writing it all down? Her grandmother looked at her for a long moment, and then she said something that Ellie would remember for the rest of her life. She said, "When you don't have much, you have to know exactly what you have. Every penny has a job to do, and if you don't tell it what that job is, it'll just disappear like smoke." That was the moment. That was where it all began. Ellie started her own notebook when she was 10 years old. It was nothing fancy, just a school composition book with a black and white marbled cover. On the first page, in her careful child's handwriting, she wrote the date and the amount of money she had, 17 cents. She had found a dime under the sofa cushions, gotten a nickel in change at the corner store, and saved 2 pennies from the handful her mother had given her to buy milk. 17 cents. It wasn't much. It was almost nothing, but it was hers, and now she knew exactly what she had. That notebook became her constant companion. She recorded everything: the quarter she earned running an errand for a neighbor, the dime she spent on a candy bar, the nickel she put aside in a jar on her dresser. She learned, slowly and painstakingly, what her grandmother had tried to teach her. That money wasn't magic. It was just a tool, and like any tool, it worked better when you knew how to use it. That wealth wasn't about how much you earned, but about what you did with what you had. That the difference between having nothing and having something wasn't always a matter of luck or circumstance, or someone else's generosity. Sometimes it was just a matter of paying attention, and she wondered even then what might be possible if she kept paying attention, if she never stopped. The years passed. Ellie graduated from high school in 1959, a skinny girl with mouse-brown hair and a quiet demeanor that made her easy to overlook. She didn't go to college. Her family couldn't afford it, and besides, girls from her neighborhood didn't usually go to college. They got jobs, they got married, they started families of their own. Ellie got a job at a fabric store downtown, measuring out yards of cotton and calico for the housewives who came in to sew their own curtains and clothes. She made 75 cents an hour, which felt like a fortune until she started trying to live on it. She rented a room in a boarding house, a tiny space with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto an alley. Her rent was $12 a week, which left her with not much for everything else: food, bus fare, soap, stockings. She couldn't afford to be careless, so she kept her notebook, just like she had since she was 10 years old. Every week, she sat down with her pencil and recorded every penny. Rent, $12. Groceries, $8.32. Bus fare, $2.10. And every week, no matter how tight things were, she made sure to set something aside. Not much, sometimes just $1, sometimes only 50 cents, but something. Her co-workers thought she was strange. They went out for lunch at the diner across the street, spending their money on hamburgers and milkshakes, and Ellie brought a sandwich from home wrapped in wax paper. They bought new dresses and went to the movies on Friday nights, and Ellie wore the same 3 outfits over and over and spent her Friday nights in her room reading library books and listening to the radio. They teased her, gently at first and then not so gently, calling her cheap, calling her boring, asking her what she was saving all that money for anyway. She didn't have a good answer. She wasn't saving for anything in particular. She wasn't dreaming of a house or a car or a trip to Paris. She was just saving because it felt safer than not saving, because having something put aside meant she didn't have to be afraid of every little emergency, every unexpected expense. It meant she had choices, even if they were small choices. It meant she wasn't powerless, but she couldn't explain that to her co-workers, so she just smiled and shrugged and let them think whatever they wanted to think. And she kept writing in her notebook. If you're still with me, if this story is resonating with you in some way, take a moment right now to hit that like button. Because what Ellie was doing, what she was building without even realizing it, is something that most people never understand. And I want to make sure you don't miss what's coming next. In 1963, Ellie met a man named Frank at a church social. He was a mechanic, a big, quiet man with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails and a smile that came slow but genuine. They dated for a year, going to movies and taking long walks through the park, and then they got married in a small ceremony at the courthouse, with Ellie wearing a borrowed dress and carrying a bouquet of daisies from the corner market. They moved into a small apartment on the second floor of a building near the railroad tracks, where the walls shook every time a train passed and the radiator clanked and hissed all winter long. Frank made a decent living, more than Ellie did, but it still wasn't much. They combined their incomes, pooled their resources, and tried to make it work. And Ellie, because it was the only way she knew how to live, kept her notebooks. She recorded everything now. Frank's paycheck, her paycheck, the rent, the electric bill, the grocery money, the cost of Frank's work boots when the old ones finally wore out. Frank thought it was funny at first, the way she was always scribbling in those notebooks, always adding up columns of numbers. But he didn't tell her to stop, and after a while he started to see the point. Because Ellie always knew exactly how much money they had. She always knew if they could afford something or if they needed to wait. She always knew when a bill was coming due, and she always made sure they had the money to pay it. There were no surprises, no overdrafts, no panicked calls to family members asking for loans. They were poor, yes, but they were never desperate. They were never out of control. And that, Frank realized, was a kind of wealth in itself. Their daughter was born in 1965, a tiny red-faced baby they named Carolyn. Ellie kept working at the fabric store for as long as she could, then took a year off to stay home with the baby before going back part-time. Money got tighter. Babies were expensive in ways Ellie hadn't fully anticipated. Diapers and formula and clothes that only fit for a month before they were too small. She made a lot of Carolyn's clothes herself, sitting up late at night at the kitchen table with her mother's old sewing machine, stitching together little dresses and pajamas from scraps and remnants. She bought groceries at the discount store, the one with the dented cans and the day-old bread. She cut coupons from the newspaper and planned meals around what was on sale. And she kept her notebooks. By now, she had filled dozens of them. They were stacked in a box under the bed, a record of every dollar she and Frank had ever earned, ever spent, ever saved. She didn't look back at the old ones very often, but sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, she would pull one out and flip through the pages, looking at the careful columns of numbers, remembering the struggles and the small victories they represented. The week they had only $3 left after paying all the bills, and she had stretched it to feed them until Frank's next paycheck came through. The month they had saved enough to buy a used television, and how they had sat on the couch together watching it, feeling like they had achieved something remarkable. But there was something else in those notebooks too. Something she was building without fully realizing it, a habit, a discipline, a way of thinking about money that was so deeply ingrained now that she couldn't imagine living any other way. And it was about to be tested in ways she never expected. When Carolyn was 3 years old, Frank's hours at the garage got cut. The owner was struggling, the economy was slowing down, and there just wasn't enough work to go around. Frank went from working 40 hours a week to working 25, sometimes less. Their income dropped by nearly half, almost overnight. Ellie picked up more shifts at the fabric store, but it wasn't enough to make up the difference. They fell behind on the rent. The electric company sent a shut-off notice. They ate a lot of pasta and beans that year, a lot of potatoes and cheap cuts of meat stretched into casseroles that lasted for days. But they didn't panic. Because Ellie had been keeping track, she knew exactly how much they needed, exactly where they could cut back, exactly how long they could hold out if things didn't get better. She sat down with Frank one evening after Carolyn was in bed, and they went through the numbers together. They made a plan. They talked to their landlord and worked out a payment arrangement. They turned off the heat and used extra blankets. They cancelled the newspaper subscription and stopped buying anything that wasn't absolutely essential. And they made it through. Barely, but they made it through. When Frank's hours finally picked back up, when things started to stabilize again, Ellie made a decision. She opened a savings account at the bank downtown, a small account that paid a tiny amount of interest, but at least kept the money separate, kept it safe. Every week, no matter what, she put something into that account. Sometimes it was $5, sometimes it was only $1, but she never missed a week, not once. Her friends at work, the ones who were still around, still thought she was crazy. They told her she should enjoy life a little, treat herself, live a little. But Ellie had learned something during those lean months, after Frank's hours got cut. She had learned that the world was unpredictable, that the things you counted on could disappear without warning, that security wasn't something someone else could give you. It was something you built yourself, $1 at a time, 1 week at a time, one decision at a time. And she was determined to keep building. If you're finding value in this story, if you're starting to see the lesson that's unfolding here, I need you to do something for me right now. Take a moment to comment below. Tell me what you think about Ellie's approach to money. Tell me if you've ever felt the same kind of financial fear she was feeling, and if you're not subscribed yet, go ahead and click that button, because the story is about to take a turn that's going to show you just how powerful this simple habit really was. The 1970s came and went. Carolyn grew up, a bright, curious girl who loved books and art and dreamed of going to college. Ellie and Frank never talked much about college, not because they didn't want it for their daughter, but because they couldn't imagine how they would ever afford it. Frank was still working at the garage, Ellie was still at the fabric store, and they were still living paycheck to paycheck, even with the careful budgeting and the savings account that was growing slowly but steadily in the background. But Carolyn brought it up one day when she was 16, sitting at the kitchen table doing her homework. She said, "Mom, I think I want to apply to colleges next year." And Ellie's heart sank, because she knew what that meant. She knew what colleges cost, knew they didn't have that kind of money, knew they couldn't ask Carolyn to take on the kind of debt that would follow her for years. But she didn't say any of that. She just said, "We'll figure it out." That night, after Carolyn had gone to bed, Ellie sat down with her notebooks. She'd been keeping track of their savings for years now, watching the balance in that account grow, dollar by dollar, week by week. It wasn't much, not by most people's standards, but it was something. She did the math, calculated what they could afford if Carolyn lived at home and went to the local community college, if she worked part-time to help with expenses, if they all tightened their belts just a little more. It would be hard, but it would be possible. Carolyn did go to community college. She studied hard, got good grades, worked evenings at a restaurant to help pay for her books and supplies. And Ellie kept working, kept saving, kept writing in her notebooks. She tracked every expense related to Carolyn's education, every tuition payment, every textbook, every fee. She made sure they never missed a payment, never fell behind. It took 4 years. But Carolyn graduated with an associate degree in business, and she didn't owe a penny to anyone. That degree got her a job at a bank, a good job with benefits and room for advancement. She moved out on her own, rented a small apartment across town, and started building a life for herself. And Ellie, for the first time in her life, felt like she had done something truly important, not because of the degree itself, but because she had made it possible. Because all those years of careful tracking, careful saving, careful choosing had added up to something real, something meaningful. But she didn't stop. She kept her notebooks, kept putting money into that savings account every week. Frank asked her once what she was saving for now that Carolyn was grown and they had no more big expenses looming. Ellie thought about it for a long time before answering. Finally, she said, "I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe just peace of mind." And Frank, who by now understood his wife better than anyone, just nodded and didn't ask again. The years continued to pass. The fabric store where Ellie worked closed down in 1985, a casualty of the big discount chains that were popping up everywhere. Ellie found a new job at the public library, shelving books and helping patrons find what they were looking for. She made less money than before, but she loved the work, loved the quiet, loved being surrounded by books. Frank kept working at the garage, though his body was starting to show the wear and tear of 40 years of hard physical labor. His back hurt most mornings, his hands ached, but he kept going because that's what you did. They were in their 60s now, and retirement was starting to feel less like a distant possibility and more like something they needed to think about seriously. Ellie looked at their finances, really looked at them, and was surprised by what she found. The savings account, the one she had been contributing to week after week for more than 30 years, had grown to over $40,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was far more than she had ever expected to have. She showed Frank the bank statement, and he stared at it for a long time, not saying anything. Finally, he said, "How did we do that?" And Ellie said, "A little bit at a time." They started talking about retirement, about what it might look like, about whether they could afford it. Ellie did the math, calculated their social security benefits, looked at their expenses, looked at their savings. It would be tight, but it would work. They could retire and live modestly, carefully, just like they always had. They could make it. Frank retired first in 1990, when his back got so bad he could barely get out of bed some mornings. Ellie retired a year later at 65 after working for nearly 50 years. They moved to a smaller apartment to save on rent, downsized their belongings, simplified their lives even further. And Ellie, because old habits die hard, kept her notebooks. She tracked their fixed income, their social security checks, their small pension from Frank's years at the garage. She tracked their rent, their utilities, their groceries. She made sure they stayed within their budget, made sure they didn't touch the savings unless they absolutely had to. And mostly, they didn't have to, because Ellie had built something. Not a fortune, not a massive nest egg, not the kind of wealth that made headlines, but something real, something solid, something that gave them options and choices and security. They could afford their medication when they needed it. They could afford to help Carolyn when her car broke down. They could afford to live with dignity, without fear, without constantly worrying about whether they were going to make it to the end of the month. That was wealth. That was what all those years of careful tracking, careful saving, careful living had been building toward. Not luxury, not extravagance, but peace. Security, freedom from fear. And if you're still here, if you're still listening, I want you to think about something. Think about what wealth really means to you. Is it about having more, or is it about being afraid less? Because that's what Ellie figured out, what she spent her whole life learning, and I promise you, the lesson gets even deeper from here. So stay with me, like this video, if it's speaking to you. And let's keep going. Frank died in 1998, at the age of 72. It was sudden, a heart attack in the middle of the night, and Ellie woke up to find him gone beside her. The grief was overwhelming, crushing, a weight she wasn't sure she could bear. They had been married for 35 years, had built a life together, had weathered every storm together, and now he was gone, and she was alone. The funeral was small, just family and a few close friends. Carolyn came and stayed with her mother for a week, helping with the arrangements, helping with all the paperwork that death requires. Ellie went through it all in a fog, barely present, barely able to process what had happened. But even in her grief, even in those darkest days, there was one thing she didn't have to worry about: money. The funeral was paid for without any strain. The bills kept getting paid. There was no financial crisis on top of the emotional one, no added layer of panic and desperation, because Ellie had prepared. Not for this, specifically, but for the uncertainty of life in general. The savings were there, the budget was there, the habit of careful management was there, and it held her up when everything else felt like it was falling apart. She stayed in the small apartment after Frank died, even though Carolyn offered to have her move in, even though it felt too big and too empty now. She kept herself busy, kept her routines, kept her notebooks. The act of writing things down, of keeping track, of making sure everything balanced was strangely comforting. It was something she could control in a world that suddenly felt very much out of control. She lived frugally, even more frugally than before. Not because she had to necessarily, but because it was who she was, how she had lived her entire life. She didn't need much. She didn't want much. She had her routines, her library books, her walks in the park. She had Carolyn, who visited regularly, who brought her grandchildren by to see her. She had enough. The years passed quietly. Ellie moved through them with the same steady, unremarkable pace she had always had. She turned 70, then 75, then 80. Her health remained good, mostly, though she slowed down as everyone does. She stopped driving after a small accident that scared her more than she wanted to admit. She started using a cane after a fall on an icy sidewalk left her with a broken wrist. She moved into a senior apartment complex, a small one-bedroom unit with a kitchenette and a bathroom with grab bars, where she could be independent but have help nearby if she needed it. And she kept her notebooks. By now there were boxes and boxes of them, a lifetime of careful record-keeping stored in the closet of her bedroom. She didn't look at them much anymore, but she liked knowing they were there, liked the solid weight of all that history, all those years of paying attention, all those small decisions that had added up to something bigger than she had ever imagined. The savings account, the one she had opened in the 1970s, now held over $75,000. It had grown slowly but steadily, fed by her continued careful management of every penny, supplemented by the interest that accumulated year after year, protected by the fact that she almost never withdrew anything unless it was truly necessary. She didn't think of it as a fortune. She thought of it as security, as a cushion, as something that would make sure she never became a burden to Carolyn, never had to depend on charity or government assistance beyond what she had already paid into. She thought of it as peace. Carolyn visited her mother regularly, usually on Sunday afternoons. They would have tea together, talk about the grandchildren, watch old movies on the television. Carolyn had done well for herself, worked her way up at the bank, bought a nice house in the suburbs, lived a comfortable life. She worried about her mother sometimes, worried that she was lonely, that she wasn't enjoying life enough, that she was still pinching pennies even though she didn't need to anymore. But Ellie seemed content. She seemed at peace in a way that Carolyn, despite having more money and more comfort, couldn't quite understand. There was something about her mother, something calm and settled and unshakable, that had always been there, but seemed even more pronounced now in her later years. One Sunday, when Ellie was 83, Carolyn brought up the subject of estate planning. She said, "Mom, have you thought about what you want to happen, after?" And Ellie said yes, she had thought about it. She had a will, had made arrangements, had everything sorted out. Carolyn was relieved, but also curious. She said, "Is there anything you want? Anything you want to do while you still can?" And Ellie thought about it for a long time before answering. Finally, she said, "I'd like to take you through my notebooks. I'd like you to understand." So the next Sunday, Ellie pulled out the first notebook, the one from when she was 10 years old, with its faded black and white marbled cover and her childish handwriting recording 17 cents. She showed it to Carolyn, explained how it had started, how her grandmother had taught her. And then she pulled out another notebook and another, walking Carolyn through decades of her life, through the struggles and the small victories, through the careful tracking of every dollar, every decision, every moment of choosing to save instead of spend, to wait instead of wanting. Carolyn had never seen anything like it. She'd known her mother kept track of expenses, had seen her with the notebooks over the years, but she had never understood the scope of it, the dedication, the sheer weight of discipline and consistency it represented. She started to cry, looking at those pages, understanding for the first time what her mother had done, what she had built, what it had cost her and what it had given her. If you're feeling emotional right now, if this is hitting you somewhere deep, I want you to know you're not alone. This is what real wealth looks like. This is what real discipline looks like. And I want you to share this story. I want you to comment, to like this video, to subscribe so more people can hear this message. Because what Ellie did, what she built, is available to anyone. You don't need to make a lot of money. You just need to pay attention. Ellie lived to be 86 years old. Her health declined slowly, gently, and when it became clear that she couldn't live independently anymore, Carolyn moved her into a good assisted living facility, the kind with nurses on staff and activities and 3 meals a day. It was expensive, but there was money to pay for it. The savings account, combined with her Social Security and the small life insurance policy from Frank, covered it without any strain, without Carolyn having to sacrifice or struggle or take on debt. Ellie lived there for 2 years, and in that time she seemed lighter somehow, as if a burden had been lifted. She made friends with the other residents, joined the book club, spent her afternoons sitting in the sunroom looking out at the garden. She stopped keeping her notebooks finally because there wasn't any need anymore. Everything was taken care of. Everything was in order. And when she died that Tuesday morning in March, peacefully in her sleep, she left behind something that money alone could never measure. She left behind the notebooks, all of them, spanning 7 decades of careful living. Carolyn took them home, packed them carefully into boxes, and stored them in her own closet. She would read through them sometimes, late at night, marveling at her mother's consistency, her discipline, her absolute refusal to be defeated by circumstances that would have crushed most people. And she started to understand that what her mother had built wasn't just a savings account or a nest egg or a legacy of financial security. It was a lesson. It was a roadmap. It was proof that wealth isn't always about how much you make, but about how you think, how you choose, how you live. Ellie's estate, when everything was settled, came to just over $82,000 after the assisted living expenses. It wasn't a huge amount, not by the standards of Wall Street or Silicon Valley or the lottery winners who make headlines, but for a woman who had never earned more than $12 an hour, who had worked ordinary jobs and lived in ordinary places and never had any extraordinary breaks or opportunities. It was remarkable. It was proof of what consistency could build, what discipline could create, what paying attention could accomplish over a lifetime. Carolyn used some of the money to pay for her own children's college education, just like her mother had done for her. She put the rest into savings, into investments, into building her own security. And she started her own notebook, writing down her expenses, tracking her spending, making conscious decisions about money instead of just letting it flow through her hands like water. She taught her own children to do the same, showed them their grandmother's notebooks, told them the story of a woman who never had much but who had built something real and lasting anyway. Because that was Ellie's true wealth. Not the money itself, but the knowledge of how to create it, how to manage it, how to make it work for you instead of against you. The knowledge that you don't have to be rich to be secure, that you don't have to earn a lot to save a lot, that the difference between financial peace and financial chaos is often just a matter of paying attention, making choices, being consistent. That was what she had figured out at age 10, sitting at the kitchen table watching her grandmother write in her little leather book. That was what she had practiced and refined and perfected over 76 years of adult life. And that was what she passed on, not just to her daughter, but to anyone willing to learn the lesson. But here's the thing. And this is the part that most people miss. Ellie's wealth wasn't really about the money at all. Yes, she accumulated a respectable nest egg through decades of careful saving. Yes, she was able to live with dignity and security in her old age. Yes, she left behind an inheritance that blessed her family. But those were just the visible results, the measurable outcomes, the things you could point to and count. The real wealth was something different. The real wealth was the peace she felt, day after day, year after year, knowing that she was in control of her financial life instead of being controlled by it. The real wealth was the freedom from the constant anxiety that eats away at so many people, the fear of the next bill, the next emergency, the next unexpected expense. The real wealth was the ability to sleep at night, to make decisions based on what was right rather than what was affordable, to help others when they needed it because she had taken care of herself first. The real wealth was the sense of dignity and self-respect that came from knowing she had built something, that she hadn't just drifted through life reacting to circumstances, that she had taken responsibility and exercised discipline and created security for herself and her family through nothing more than consistency and attention and care. That kind of wealth, the internal kind, the invisible kind, is far more valuable than any bank account because it doesn't depend on circumstances. It doesn't depend on the economy or the stock market or your employer's generosity. It doesn't disappear if you lose your job or if the company goes under or if the market crashes. It's yours, and no one can take it away from you. Ellie understood that in a way that most people never do. She understood that true wealth wasn't something you achieved at a certain income level or a certain net worth. It was something you built inside yourself through choices and habits and discipline. It was a way of thinking, a way of being, a way of moving through the world with your eyes open and your hands steady and your mind clear. And here's what's beautiful about that kind of wealth. It's available to everyone. You don't need a high income to start. You don't need special education or connections or lucky breaks. You don't need to be born into the right family or live in the right place or catch the right opportunity at the right time. You just need a notebook and a pencil and the willingness to pay attention. You need to write down what you have, what comes in, what goes out. You need to see the patterns, the leaks, the places where money disappears without your noticing. You need to make conscious choices instead of unconscious ones, to decide what's important and what's not, to say no to some things so you can say yes to the things that matter most. You need to be consistent, to keep going even when it's hard, even when it feels pointless, even when the numbers are so small they seem meaningless. Because here's the truth that Ellie discovered. Small numbers aren't meaningless. Small, consistent actions, repeated over time, compound into something extraordinary. $1 a week is $52 a year, which doesn't sound like much until you multiply it by 50 years and realize it's $2,600. And that's just the raw saving, not counting any interest or growth. Add in consistent discipline, careful management, smart choices about spending, and suddenly that number grows to something you never expected. But more than that, the habit itself grows. The discipline grows. The sense of control and peace grows. And those things, those internal things, are worth far more than the money itself. Take a moment right now and reflect on your own life. Think about where you are financially. Think about whether you feel in control or out of control, whether you feel peaceful or anxious, whether you know where your money goes or whether it just disappears. And if you're feeling convicted, if you're feeling like maybe it's time to make a change, hit that like button. Leave a comment. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me if you're going to start your own notebook. And subscribe, because I'm going to keep telling stories like this. Stories that challenge the way we think about money and wealth and success. Ellie's story spread slowly, quietly, the way most meaningful things do. Carolyn would tell people about her mother, about the notebooks, about the life of discipline and peace they represented. She told her friends, her co-workers, her book club. She told people at church, at the grocery store, at the bank where she worked. And people were fascinated because it was so different from the stories they usually heard about wealth. There were no get-rich-quick schemes, no lucky investments, no windfalls or inheritances or lottery wins. Just a woman with a notebook and a commitment to paying attention day after day, decade after decade. Some people tried to replicate it. They started their own notebooks, started tracking their expenses, started making conscious choices about money. Some of them stuck with it and saw their lives change, saw debt disappear and savings grow and anxiety fade. Others quit after a few weeks or months, finding it too tedious, too restrictive, too much work for results that seemed too small to matter. But the ones who stuck with it understood what Ellie had understood, that it wasn't really about the money. It was about the person you became in the process of managing the money. It was about developing discipline, about practicing patience, about learning to delay gratification and think long-term and make choices that your future self would thank you for. It was about building character, building integrity, building a solid foundation under your life that could support you through anything. One of the people who heard Ellie's story was a young woman named Maria, a single mother working 2 jobs and barely keeping her head above water. She was drowning in debt, living paycheck to paycheck, constantly stressed about money and terrified of what would happen if one of her kids got sick or her car broke down or she lost one of her jobs. She felt hopeless, trapped, like there was no way out. Then a co-worker told her about Ellie, about the notebooks, about a woman who had never made much money, but who had built security anyway through simple discipline and consistency. Maria was skeptical at first. How could writing things down in a notebook possibly help? She didn't have any extra money to save. She was already behind on everything. But something about the story stayed with her, nagged at her, made her think. So she tried it. She bought a cheap spiral notebook at the dollar store and started writing down everything she spent. And she was horrified by what she saw. Money was leaking out everywhere, in small amounts she never noticed because she wasn't paying attention. $5 here for coffee, $3 there for a snack, $10 for something she couldn't even remember. It added up to hundreds of dollars a month, money that just vanished into thin air. She started making changes. Small changes at first. She brought coffee from home instead of stopping at the drive-thru. She meal planned and made a grocery list and stuck to it instead of wandering the aisles, buying whatever looked good. She cancelled subscriptions she didn't use, stopped buying things on impulse, started asking herself before every purchase whether this was something she really needed or just something she wanted in the moment. The debt didn't disappear overnight. The savings didn't magically appear, but slowly, gradually things started to shift. She wasn't constantly overdrafting her checking account anymore. She wasn't getting hit with late fees and overdraft charges. She managed to put $50 into a savings account, then $100, then $500. It wasn't much, but it was something, and it was more than she had ever had before. And more importantly, she felt different. She felt less anxious, less out of control, less like a victim of circumstances beyond her power. She felt like she was making progress, like she was building something, like her life was heading in a direction she had chosen rather than being dragged along by forces she couldn't resist. That was Ellie's gift, Ellie's legacy, not just to her own daughter, but to anyone who heard her story and understood the lesson, that wealth isn't primarily about money, it's about control, it's about peace, it's about building a life on solid ground instead of shifting sand. In a world that constantly tells us to spend, to upgrade, to buy now and pay later, to keep up with everyone else, to live for the moment because you only live once, Ellie's story is radical. It's countercultural. It's a quiet rebellion against the messages that bombard us from every direction, telling us that happiness comes from having more, from spending more, from consuming more. Ellie's life said something different. It said that happiness comes from having enough, that peace comes from knowing what you have and where it's going, that true wealth is measured not by what you own, but by what you owe, not by your income, but by your options, not by the size of your house, but by the size of your freedom. She lived in small apartments her entire life, never owned a home, never drove a new car, never took exotic vacations or ate at expensive restaurants or wore designer clothes. By the world's standards, by the standards of Instagram and reality TV and aspirational advertising, her life would have looked small, poor, unsuccessful. But by the standards that actually matter, by the standards of peace and security and dignity and freedom from fear, her life was rich beyond measure. And that's the lesson, that's the point, that's what this whole story is about. We've been lied to about what wealth means. We've been told it's about having more, earning more, spending more, showing more. We've been told that success means a big house and a nice car and expensive vacations and all the trappings of affluence. We've been told that if we're not constantly upgrading, constantly acquiring, constantly consuming, then we're somehow failing at life. But Ellie knew better. She knew that real wealth, the kind that lasts, the kind that sustains you through hard times and gives you peace in good times, has nothing to do with any of that. Real wealth is knowing you can pay your bills. It's being able to sleep at night without worrying about money. It's having options when life throws you a curveball. It's being able to help others without putting yourself at risk. It's living below your means so you have margin, have breathing room, have a cushion between you and disaster. Real wealth is freedom. And you can't buy freedom with money. You build freedom by managing money well. If this message is resonating with you, if you're starting to see wealth differently, if you're beginning to understand what Ellie figured out all those years ago, I want you to do something. I want you to commit right now to starting your own version of Ellie's practice. Get a notebook. Start tracking, start paying attention, and then come back here and leave a comment telling me you did it. Tell me what you discovered. Tell me what changed. Because this isn't just a story. It's a roadmap. It's an invitation. It's a proven path that anyone can follow. Eleanor passed away without any fame, without any recognition, without any headlines or awards or public acknowledgement. Her obituary in the local paper was 3 paragraphs long, listing her surviving daughter and grandchildren, noting her years of service at the library, mentioning that she was preceded in death by her husband Frank. There was nothing in it about the notebooks, about the decades of discipline, about the quiet, remarkable things she had built with her life. But the people who knew her, the people who understood, carried her story with them. Carolyn told her children, and they told their children. Maria told her friends, and they told their friends. The story spread in small ways, through personal conversations and quiet recommendations, person to person, life to life. And in each person who heard it and understood it and applied it, something changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily, consistently, the same way Ellie's savings had grown, the same way her peace had deepened, the same way her life had testified to a truth that the world desperately needs to hear. Years after Ellie's death, Carolyn donated the notebooks to the local historical society. She wanted them preserved, wanted them available for people to see, wanted her mother's legacy to continue. The Historical Society created a small exhibit called A Life Counted, One Woman's Financial Journey. It featured some of the notebooks in a glass case, along with photographs of Ellie at different ages, and a placard explaining the story. The exhibit wasn't flashy. It didn't have interactive displays or dramatic lighting or celebrity endorsements, but people came to see it. They stood in front of that glass case and looked at those worn notebooks with their careful columns of numbers, and something in them shifted. Because they could see themselves in Ellie's story. They could see their own struggles, their own fears, their own dreams of something better. And they could see that it was possible, that someone had done it, that the path was real and walkable and led somewhere worth going. The exhibit included a quote from Carolyn, printed on the wall beside the case. It said, "My mother never made a lot of money, but she made every dollar count. She proved that wealth isn't about what you earn, it's about what you keep, what you build, and what you become in the process." Underneath the quote was an invitation. Start your own financial journal today. Pay attention to where your money goes. Make conscious choices. Be consistent. Your future self will thank you. Some people read that invitation and walked away unmoved, unchanged, still convinced that their financial problems were too big, too complicated, too far gone to be fixed by something as simple as a notebook and a commitment to paying attention. They were waiting for the big break, the lucky investment, the inheritance, the lottery win. They were waiting for someone else to save them, but others read it and felt something stir inside them. A spark of hope, maybe, a whisper of possibility. The idea that they didn't have to wait, didn't have to be rescued, didn't have to stay stuck forever. The idea that they could start right now, right where they were, with whatever they had. That they could take control, make choices, build something even if it was small, especially if it was small because small was where Ellie had started and look where she had ended up. Those were the ones who left that exhibit and bought a notebook, who started tracking, who began the long, slow, unglamorous work of paying attention and making choices and being consistent. And some of them, years later, would look back and realize that seeing those notebooks, hearing Ellie's story, was the moment their lives began to change, because that's how transformation happens. Not in dramatic moments, not in sudden windfalls, not in lucky breaks, but in quiet decisions, in small, consistent actions, in the daily choice to do what's right even when it's hard, to do what's wise even when it's boring, to keep going even when the results are too small to see. Ellie's life was a testament to that truth. She never did anything remarkable by the world's standards. She just showed up day after day, year after year, decade after decade, and did the small, boring discipline of paying attention to her money. And in doing so, she built something remarkable after all, not a fortune, but something better, a life of peace, dignity, security, and freedom. That's available to you right now, today. You don't have to wait for circumstances to change, or for someone to rescue you, or for lightning to strike. You can start exactly where Ellie started, with nothing more than a notebook, a pencil, and the willingness to pay attention. You can write down what you have. You can track what comes in and what goes out. You can see the patterns, the leaks, the opportunities. You can make choices instead of just reacting. You can say no to things that don't matter, so you can say yes to things that do. You can save a little, even when it seems pointless, because a little over time becomes a lot. You can be consistent, even when it's hard, because consistency is what compounds. And slowly, gradually, maybe so slowly you don't even notice at first, your life will change. The anxiety will ease, the debt will shrink, the savings will grow, the options will increase, the peace will deepen, and you'll realize that you're building wealth. The real kind, the kind that matters, the kind that lasts. Not because you got lucky, or because you made a lot of money, or because circumstances finally broke your way, but because you did what Ellie did. You paid attention, you made choices, you were consistent, you built it yourself, one day at a time, $1 at a time, one decision at a time. That's the power of habit, that's the power of discipline, that's the power of living intentionally instead of accidentally. That's what Ellie discovered, what she practiced, what she proved with her life. And that's what she's offering to you, through her story, through her example, through the simple but profound truth that she lived every day for decades. The real tragedy isn't being poor. The real tragedy is being out of control, being at the mercy of circumstances, living in constant fear and anxiety about money because you never took the time to understand it, to manage it, to make it work for you instead of against you. The real tragedy is having money flow through your hands year after year, decade after decade, and having nothing to show for it at the end because you never paid attention to where it was going. Ellie refused to live that tragedy. She refused to be a victim. She refused to let circumstances dictate her destiny. And because of that refusal, because of that quiet, stubborn determination to pay attention and take control and be consistent, she built a life that was richer, in all the ways that matter, than most people who made 10 times what she made. That's the lesson. That's the invitation. That's the challenge. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to walk away from this story and go back to living the way you've always lived, letting money slip through your fingers without really knowing where it goes, staying stuck in the same patterns that have kept you anxious and struggling? Are you going to keep waiting for something to change, for someone to rescue you, for circumstances to magically improve? Or are you going to do what Ellie did? Are you going to get a notebook and start paying attention? Are you going to face the truth about your money, see where it's really going, make conscious choices about where you want it to go instead? Are you going to commit to the small, boring discipline of tracking and managing and being consistent, even when it feels pointless, even when the results are too small to see? Because if you do, if you really commit to this, if you stick with it the way Ellie stuck with it for 7 decades, your life will change. Not tomorrow, not next week, probably not even next month. But over time, gradually, inevitably, your life will change. The anxiety will ease, the debt will shrink, the savings will grow, the peace will come. And one day, maybe years from now, you'll look back and realize that this moment, this story, this decision to start paying attention was the turning point. The moment everything began to shift. The moment you stopped being a victim of circumstances and became the architect of your own financial destiny. That's what Ellie offers you. Not a get-rich-quick scheme, not a magic formula, not an easy path to instant wealth, but something better. A proven path to real wealth, the kind that lasts, the kind that sustains, the kind that brings peace. A path that anyone can walk regardless of income or circumstances or background. A path that requires nothing more than a notebook, a pencil, and the willingness to pay attention. The question is, are you willing? If you've made it this far, if you've stayed with me through this entire story, then I think you are. I think something in you recognizes the truth of what Ellie discovered. I think something in you is hungry for the peace and security and freedom that she built. I think you're ready to start. So start. Today, right now. Get a notebook. Write down what you have. Track what comes in and what goes out. See the truth of your financial situation, however uncomfortable that might be, and then make a plan. Make choices. Be consistent, and come back here and tell me you did it. Leave a comment, share your story. Join the community of people who are walking this path, who are building their own version of Ellie's legacy, who are proving that real wealth isn't about how much you make, but about what you do with what you have. Because that's the final lesson. The ultimate truth that Ellie's life teaches us. Wealth isn't something that happens to you. It's something you build. It's something you create. It's something you choose, day after day, decision after decision, dollar after dollar. Ellie never earned much money, but through one simple habit, practiced consistently over a lifetime, she became truly wealthy. Not because she accumulated a lot of money, though she did accumulate more than anyone expected, but because she built peace, she built security, she built freedom, she built dignity, she built control, she built options, she built a life that was solid, stable, unshakable, regardless of what the world threw at her. That's true wealth, and it's available to you. Starting now, starting today, starting with a notebook and a decision and a commitment to pay attention. The rest is just time and consistency, just like it was for Ellie.